Jonathan Roumie stepped onto the late-night talk show stage just days after Pope Francis's death, and the air grew heavy with anticipation. The audience expected a lighthearted chat, perhaps stories about the chosen, or reflections on playing Jesus. But something was off from the start. The host tried to steer the conversation toward laughter, but Jonathan wasn't following the script. His demeanor was solemn, his gaze sharp, and then he froze when he saw a small golden rosary placed quietly on the table. In that moment, everything shifted. Questions turned probing, answers carried secrets. What began as a casual interview spiraled into a shocking revelation, a silent confession, and a truth buried for years. By the time the final words were spoken, the audience wasn't clapping. They were witnessing Jonathan break years of silence on live television, unveiling a clandestine Vatican encounter. What was this secret? What truth could silence an entire studio? The studio lights flickered briefly before steadying their glow, reflecting off the eager faces of the audience. They buzzed with excitement for tonight's special guest. Normally, this was just another late-night talk show, quips about celebrities, Hollywood gossip, or behind-the-scenes chuckles. But tonight felt different, not just because the world was still reeling from Pope Francis's passing. The host, all charm and polished smile, projected his voice across the room. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Roumie. Thunderous applause erupted. A few audience members stood, and some discreetly raised phones to record, despite the studio's no filming policy. Jonathan entered with slow, silent steps, dressed in a black suit, no tie, his hair slightly longer than usual. His expression was courteous but distant. He shook the host's hand gently and sat across from him. On the table between them lay a glass of water, a few cue cards, and curiously a small golden rosary resting on a cushion of deep blue velvet. Jonathan, the host, began keeping the tone light. What a time, huh? The Pope's passed, and you still look timeless. What's your secret holy water? The audience laughed, but Jonathan offered only a faint smile, his eyes falling to the rosary, not a passing glance but a pause that lingered. The silence stretched, awkward at first, then heavy. The audience quieted, sensing a shift. Everything okay? The host asked, forcing a chuckle. You're even more introspective than usual tonight. Jonathan took a deep breath, his fingertips lightly brushing the rosary, his gaze unfocused as if diving into a long-buried memory. That night in Rome, he told me something. He said, his voice low, almost as if speaking to himself. Something no one has ever heard. The host leaned forward, intrigued. The audience held its breath. Maybe today, maybe I need to say it. The studio froze. Was this a scripted moment, a clever promo for a project? But Jonathan wasn't acting. There was no trace of performance in his face. Say what the host asked, trying to regain control. Jonathan looked at him, but his eyes seemed to pierce through, reaching somewhere far beyond. What Pope Francis entrusted to me, he said. What he didn't want to take to his grave. The audience was silent, the host exchanging a nervous glance with the off-camera crew, but no voice came through his earpiece. Jonathan wasn't here to promote the chosen. He was here to unveil a secret. Years ago, he began, his voice soft but steady. I received an invitation that didn't seem real. Jonathan sat straighter, the rosary still before him. I was in Florence filming a small European project, nothing flashy. One night at my hotel, a man knocked on my door. He didn't give his name, just handed me an envelope sealed with the Vatican's insignia. The audience was rapt. Inside was a personal invitation handwritten by Pope Francis himself. The host raised his eyebrows, visibly surprised. What did it say? He asked. Jonathan stared into the distance, as if rereading the letter in his mind. It said, I would like to walk with you in silence among the olive trees. That was all. No cameras, no press, just those words. The studio's atmosphere turned sacred, almost liturgical. And you went, the host asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan nodded. Of course I went. I thought maybe he knew something or wanted help, a donation, something practical. I didn't know, but what I found was far beyond anything I could have imagined. He paused, a heavy silence blanketing the room. I was driven to the Vatican in a plain car through a side entrance. The night was cold. An older man was waiting. We walked through a maze of corridors, then stepped into a garden. There, under an ancient tree, he was waiting for me. Jonathan hesitated, then continued. The Pope looked exhausted, frail, but his eyes were more alive than anything I've ever seen. The host stayed quiet, listening intently, as did the audience, utterly captivated. He spoke immediately, Jonathan said. He told me he'd seen footage of me visiting a children's hospital anonymously. He said that silent act spoke louder than any sermon. He took a deep breath. Then he confessed. He said he felt God had been silent with him for years. The words landed like a stone, sending a chill through the studio. He talked about the burden of Peter's chair, the pain of representing something greater than himself while feeling utterly alone. He prayed, but the heavens felt mute. Jonathan looked at the audience, urgency in his eyes. Faith survives silence, and he told me, but I fear one day it may begin to mimic it. The host, now subdued, asked, "What did you say?" Jonathan shook his head. "Nothing, I just listened." His voice dropped lower. Then he pulled an envelope from his pocket, sealed with red wax. He said, "If I don't see you again, this secret must live." The words rang like an invisible bell echoing through the room. What was this secret? Would Jonathan reveal it live on air, or keep the silence the Pope had asked for? The studio held its breath, waiting for the moment that would change everything. The late-night talk show studio had become a realm of hushed silence, as if time itself held its breath. Jonathan Roumie sat under the glaring stage lights, his gaze piercing the small golden rosary on the table, a silent anchor to the secret he'd begun to unveil. The audience, still reeling from his tale of a clandestine Vatican meeting with Pope Francis, waited with bated breath. The host, accustomed to steering any situation, was visibly rattled, unsure how to navigate the bombshell. Jonathan had dropped a sealed envelope, entrusted by the Pope, holding a secret not meant to die with him. Would Jonathan open it live on air, or honor the silence he'd promised? The cameras zoomed in, but the shadows of the story deepened, drawing everyone into a mystery darker than the Vatican's ancient walls. The host, regaining a sliver of composure, leaned toward Jonathan. What's the secret?" he asked, his voice betraying a tremor, as if fearing the answer might shatter the studio's fragile calm. Jonathan met his gaze, but his eyes seemed to reach beyond, into a distant memory where the Vatican's Olive Garden still lingered. What he couldn't tell anyone else, he replied, his voice low but resolute. What he believed I, an outsider, could carry. The audience sat frozen, some gripping their seats, sensing the weight of the moment. Jonathan drew a deep breath, his fingers grazing the golden rosary. That night in the Olive Garden, he continued, the Pope didn't just speak of God's silence. He spoke of the Church, the burdens he bore, and the shadows he couldn't dispel. He paused, his eyes sweeping the audience, ensuring they grasped the gravity. He said there were forces within the Church, those who wore crosses on their chests, but moved like wolves. The words cut like a blade, sending a shiver through the crowd. The host opened his mouth to speak, but thought better of it, letting Jonathan press on. "He gave me that envelope," Jonathan said, his voice dropping almost a whisper. "He told me, if I'm no longer here, you must decide what to do with it." I didn't understand then. I thought it might be a message, a will, something simple. But holding it, it felt like holding fire. He glanced at the rosary as if it tethered him to that memory. I brought it back, kept it for years, through every film set, every hotel room. I didn't open it. I told myself it wasn't my place. The host, now fully drawn into the narrative, asked, "You never wanted to know what was inside?" Jonathan gave a faint, weary smile. "Of course I did, countless times. But each time I reached for it, I saw his eyes, hopeful yet afraid. I couldn't break that trust." He paused, his voice growing heavier, until I heard he'd passed. Then I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. The studio was so quiet that the faint hum of stage equipment seemed deafening. The audience sensed something monumental was imminent. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the rosary. "I kept that envelope hidden for years," he said. "It stayed with me, a constant reminder. But when he died, I felt like he was calling me to speak." Slowly, with the care of someone handling a sacred relic, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an aged envelope, yellowed by time, sealed with crimson wax bearing the papal crest. The audience stirred, some craning to see. The host's jaw dropped. You brought it here?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. Jonathan nodded, holding the envelope up for the cameras. "I didn't plan to open it tonight," he said. "But when I saw this rosary, I knew I had no choice." He cradled the envelope, his fingers trembling, not from fear, but from reverence. The soft crack of breaking wax, though faint, echoed like thunder in the silent studio. He opened it, drawing out a thin sheet of paper, its handwritten words trembling but clear. The audience held its breath, the host barely breathing. Jonathan began to read, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a world. To the man of silence, he read, "Who listens more than he speaks and sees more than he shows." The audience leaned forward as if the letter spoke to them directly. This world needs no more saints in gold. It needs men who carry light through the shadows cast by those meant to protect it. Jonathan paused, swallowing hard, his voice thick with emotion. "I write this with a heart torn between duty and despair. For years I fought behind marble walls, wearing the fisherman's crown in a sea of secrets." He looked up, his gaze piercing. "There are forces in this church I could never cleanse. They wear crosses but move like wolves. I tried to expose them. I failed." The audience shuddered, whispers rippling through the room. The host, his confidence gone, ventured, "You're saying there's a conspiracy in the Vatican?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He continued reading. "Now, if my voice is silenced, I ask you, an outsider untouched by my world's politics, to carry this truth, not to destroy, but to preserve." The letter was a curse, cloaking the studio in oppressive silence. Jonathan folded the paper but held it tightly. He looked at the host, his eyes heavy with meaning. "There's more," he said, his voice quieter. "Another part in the envelope." He drew out a second, smaller sheet, dense with handwritten text. "This isn't a letter," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's a prophecy." The audience murmured, the sound like wind through dry leaves. The host, fully ensnared, asked, "A prophecy about what?" Jonathan held the paper, his eyes darkening. He wrote, "The one who will undo me shall not come from within. He will smile, dress as a friend, but carry the void." The words struck like a blow, chilling the studio. He believed the collapse of faith would come not from heresy, but from imitation, from someone who seems pure, but brings emptiness. Silence descended heavy as lead. The host, struggling to find his voice, asked, "Do you think it's already begun?" Jonathan didn't answer at once. He looked at the audience, his gaze a warning. After this letter, he said, everything changed. Jonathan's story was far from over. The letter, the prophecy, and the secret he carried from the Vatican were only the beginning. What lay ahead, dreams, anonymous warnings, and a shadowed figure, would thrust him into the heart of a storm greater than he imagined. The studio remained hushed, but the audience knew what Jonathan was about to reveal could reshape not just their view of the church, but of the world itself. The studio of the late-night talk show was a crucible of silence, every breath held as Jonathan Roumie's words reverberated through the room. The small golden rosary on the table gleamed under the stage lights, a silent witness to the bombshell he'd just dropped. A letter from Pope Francis read live on air, revealing a hidden battle within the church and a chilling prophecy about a figure who would smile, dress as a friend, but carry the void. The audience, transfixed, leaned forward, their earlier expectations of casual banter shattered. The host, visibly shaken, struggled to keep pace with the gravity of Jonathan's revelations. The cameras captured every moment, but the real weight lay in what was yet to come. Secrets, dreams, and warnings that would pull Jonathan deeper into a mystery, threatening to engulf not just the Vatican, but the world. As he held the Pope's prophecy in his hands, the studio braced for the next chapter of a truth too heavy to bear. The host, his voice unsteady, broke the silence. "A prophecy? That's a lot to take in, Jonathan," he said, glancing nervously at the audience. "You're saying the Pope believes someone pretending to be good, could destroy faith itself?" Jonathan nodded slowly, his eyes dark with the weight of memory. He didn't just believe it, he said, his voice low but firm. He feared it was already happening. The audience murmured, a ripple of unease spreading through the room. The host shifted in his seat, clearly hoping for a producer's cue to cut to commercial, but no signal came. Jonathan wasn't done. He set the prophecy sheet down beside the rosary, his fingers lingering on the paper. "After that night in the Vatican," he said, "I didn't speak of it to anyone. Not my family, not my closest friends. I carried the envelope unopened for years. But when I heard of his death, something shifted inside me." He paused, his gaze sweeping the audience. And then, the letters started coming. The host's eyes widened. Letters from who? Jonathan's expression tightened, a flicker of caution crossing his face. I don't know, he said. They were anonymous, all of them, but they were connected to him. The studio was so quiet that the faint hum of the cameras felt intrusive. Jonathan reached into a folder beside him, pulling out a single sheet of paper, aged but newer than the Pope's letter. This was the first, he said, holding it up. No return address, no signature. Just these words. He read, his voice steady but laced with tension. Do not open the envelope. There are forces watching. Silence protects more than you imagine. The audience stirred, some gasping, others whispering. The host leaned forward, his voice tight. That sounds like a threat. Jonathan nodded, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for unseen watchers. It was the first of 6 over 4 years. Each from a different place, in different handwriting, but all saying the same thing: don't reveal what I know. He set the letter down, his voice growing quieter. At first I thought they came from inside the church, trying to protect the Pope's secret. But over time I saw patterns, connections I couldn't ignore. The host, now fully ensnared, asked, what kind of connections? Jonathan's gaze darkened. Deaths, he said simply. Reformist priests, journalists digging into Vatican finances, voices silenced too soon. He pulled a thin folder from his side, opening it to reveal newspaper clippings and scribbled notes. This man, he said, sliding a photo across the table, a young, smiling priest. Father Matteo from Palermo. He spoke out about corruption in church finances. He vanished on his way to Rome. Another clipping followed. A journalist found dead in the Tiber River. She'd just published an expose on Vatican real estate ties to shadow companies. They called it suicide, but her work was too dangerous for that. The audience was riveted, some clutching their hands, others exchanging wide-eyed glances. The host, visibly unsettled, reached for his water but didn't drink. Jonathan, this is heavy. Are you saying these were linked to the Pope's secret? Jonathan didn't answer directly. He slid another item across the table, a photocopy of a page with a crude sketch of an eye and 3 words, Sine, Nomine, vivat. Without name it lives, he translated, his voice low. I found this phrase in margins of old Bibles locked in forgotten archives. Not online, not cataloged, just hidden over and over like a warning. The host stared at the paper, his voice barely a whisper. What does it mean? Jonathan's eyes narrowed. It's not a group, not an organization. It's a belief, a quiet network of those who no longer trust the church, but still believe in God. The audience murmured the phrase Sine Nomine, echoing like a forbidden incantation. The host pressed, and the Pope. Did he trust them? Jonathan shook his head. No, he feared them, but he thought they might be necessary because he knew the church as it was might not survive what's coming. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jonathan's words hung in the air, unsettling and prophetic. The host tried to lighten the mood, his voice strained. This is big, Jonathan. Prophecies, secret networks. Maybe we should take a breather. But Jonathan's voice cut through, not loud but final. This isn't a story. It's a warning. He leaned back, his eyes returning to the rosary. And there's more. The host's face paled. More, Jonathan nodded, his voice unwavering. After the Pope's death, I started having dreams. Or maybe something more. The audience leaned forward, a collective shiver running through the room. Jonathan's gaze drifted as if seeing the dream again. I was in a vast abandoned basilica, he said. Dust covered everything, no candles, no prayers, just silence. My footsteps echoed like thunder. I didn't know where I was, but it felt sacred and forsaken. He paused, his voice softening. At the altar he was there, Pope Francis standing waiting, not frail like before, but calm, almost radiant. The host whispered, "What did he say?" Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his voice steady but heavy. He said, "You thought you were only an actor, but you were always more. You carry silence like a mantle with dignity." The audience exhaled as one, a shared gasp of awe. He told me the church was drowning in its own echo, that God's voice was buried under centuries of noise. Only someone who values silence could hear it again. The host swallowed hard. Do you think it was really him? I don't know, Jonathan admitted, his voice raw. But it changed me. Since that night, I've been different. I've read scripture theology, even apocryphal texts, trying to understand what he wanted. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small worn notebook. I started writing thought symbols, questions. Sometimes it feels like I'm not the one writing. The host, visibly shaken, asked, "Are you afraid, Jonathan?" Jonathan paused, his eyes searching the audience. I was for a long time, but now I think the fear was just the first test. He looked back at the rosary, his voice softening. In the dream, he said one more thing before it ended. The host waited, barely breathing. "Your silence will be a door," he said, "but you must decide if others walk through it or if it stays locked forever." The studio was silent, the weight of the words crushing the air. The host, overwhelmed, managed a weak smile. "This wasn't what I expected tonight." Jonathan's lips curved faintly, but his smile was tired, worn. "It wasn't what I expected when I walked into the Vatican either." The host pressed, "So why now? Why share this on live TV?" Jonathan looked directly into the camera, his voice resolute. "Because truth is quieter than lies. If I don't speak now, I might never get another chance." He paused, his gaze intense. "And because there's something I need to show you." The audience braced itself, sensing the story was far from over. The prophecy, the anonymous letters in the dream were only the beginning. What Jonathan held next would push the mystery into uncharted territory where shadows loomed larger than the light. The late-night talk show studio was a vortex of tension, every soul captivated by Jonathan Roumie's unraveling of a secret that spanned years and continents. The golden rosary on the table gleamed like a silent sentinel, bearing witness to the weight of his words, a letter from Pope Francis revealing a hidden war within the church, a prophecy of a false friend who would hollow out faith in a dream where the Pope himself urged Jonathan to carry a truth through silence. The audience sat spellbound, their earlier expectations of light-hearted banter obliterated by the gravity of his tale. The host, his composure fraying, struggled to anchor the show as Jonathan's revelations grew darker. Anonymous warnings, a mysterious Sine Nomine network, and deaths tied to Vatican secrets. Now, as Jonathan reached for something new in his folder, the studio braced for a moment that could shatter the fragile line between mystery and danger. The cameras rolled, but the truth he was about to unveil threatened to outshine them all. The host, his voice tight, ventured a question. "Jonathan, you've shared so much prophecies, dreams, warnings. What's left to show us?" His attempt at levity fell flat. The audience's eyes locked on Jonathan. The actor, known for portraying Jesus in The Chosen, leaned forward, his expression a mix of resolve and weariness. "Something that was never meant to be seen," he said, his voice low but unwavering. He reached into his folder, his fingers trembling, not with fear but with the weight of inevitability. The studio was so quiet that the rustle of paper sounded like a thunderclap. Jonathan pulled out a small rectangular object, holding it face down, hidden from view. "This," he said, his voice steady as a photograph from that night in the Vatican. A private moment someone else captured. The audience stirred, a murmur rippling through the room. The host's eyes widened. "A photograph of you and the Pope." Jonathan nodded, his gaze dropping to the rosary as if seeking strength. "Yes, me and the Pope in the garden. But there's something else in it." The host's voice cracked. What Jonathan flipped the photo over, but kept it angled away from the cameras, only the host catching a glimpse. "A figure," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A hooded one in the background, barely visible." The audience gasped, some craning their necks to see. Jonathan placed the photograph on the table, face up but shielded from the camera's full view. "This figure appears in 3 other images I've received over the years," he said. "Always watching, always hidden." The host squinted at the photo, his face paling. "Who is it? I don't know," Jonathan admitted, his eyes scanning the studio as if the figure might lurk among them. "But the Pope warned me in the dream. You'll see the shadow before you see the light." The words hung like a storm cloud, chilling the room. The host, visibly shaken, tried to regain control. "Could it be anyone? A guard? A gardener?" Jonathan shook his head. "Maybe, but this same figure shows up in 3 other photos sent to me anonymously, always in different places, always distant, always watching." He reached into his folder again, laying out 2 more photographs, carefully blocking the cameras from capturing too much. "This one," he said, pointing to a grainy image, came a year after the Vatican meeting. It's me at a charity event in Rome. The figure's there in the crowd hooded. He slid another across. This was 2 years later outside a church in Lisbon, where I was praying. Same figure, same distance. The audience murmured, the host's hands gripping the table. Jonathan, this is unsettling. Why didn't you go to the police? Jonathan's lips curved into a bitter smile. I tried. Private investigators' contacts in Europe, nothing. No fingerprints, no CCTV footage. Whoever sent these, they knew how to stay invisible. He paused, his voice growing heavier. But the Pope's last words to me that night in the garden echoed in my mind. You will see the shadow before you see the light. The host swallowed hard. You think this figure is the one he warned about? The one from the prophecy? Jonathan didn't answer directly. He looked at the rosary, his fingers brushing it lightly. After the dream, I started digging deeper, he said, not just into the letters, but into what the Pope feared. I found notes hidden in old Bibles, locked in archives never digitized, marginal scribbles, sometimes in Latin, sometimes symbols. Always the same phrase, se nomine vivit. The audience stirred, the phrase now familiar, but no less ominous. It's not just a belief, Jonathan continued. It's a network moving in silence, watching, waiting. The Pope didn't trust them, but he thought they might be the only way to save faith from what's coming. The host, his voice barely above a whisper, asked, What's coming? Jonathan's eyes darkened, not with fear, but with a weary understanding. He believed the church's greatest threat wasn't from outside atheists, scandals, wars. It was from within, from someone who'd mimic its light but bring emptiness. He paused, his voice dropping. He called it starving from illusion. Not a collapse of truth, but a hunger for something false. The audience was silent, the weight of the prophecy sinking in. The host tried to shift gears, his tone forced. This is a lot, Jonathan. You're talking about shadows, networks, a figure stalking you. Are you safe? Jonathan's gaze met his unflinching. I don't know, but what scares me more is what happens if I stay silent. He reached into his folder again, pulling out a newer sheet of paper, its edges worn, but the text typewritten. This arrived weeks before the Pope died, he said. No sender, just slipped under my hotel room door. He read, his voice steady but tense. He is surrounded. If you open the envelope, there will be consequences. Silence protects more than you know. The audience gasped, the host's face draining of color. Another warning, he asked. Jonathan nodded. The letters kept coming, all different, all urgent, all saying the same thing. Stay quiet. He set the note down, his voice growing firmer. I tried to trace them, investigators, security teams, nothing. Whoever sent these was a ghost. He pulled out a thin stack of clippings and notes, laying them carefully on the table. Then I found more patterns. A priest in Palermo, Father Matteo, who exposed church corruption, gone. A journalist in Rome, dead after investigating Vatican finances. Their deaths were ruled accidents, but the timing, it wasn't chance. The studio was a sea of hushed awe, the audience hanging on every word. The host, his voice trembling, asked, You think these are tied to the Sine Nomine network? Jonathan's eyes narrowed. I don't know, but the Pope feared something or someone was moving in the shadows, wearing the face of a friend. He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And then came the dream again, just before his death. The audience leaned closer, a collective shiver running through the room. I was back in the abandoned basilica, Jonathan said, his voice soft but vivid. The dust, the silence, the echo of my steps. The Pope was there at the altar, his face calm but urgent. He said, The shadow is closer than you think. Your silence is a door, but it won't stay shut forever. The host's eyes widened. He appeared again. Jonathan nodded, his expression haunted. He told me I wasn't chosen by chance. Not because I play Jesus, but because I carry silence with dignity, because I'm an outsider untouched by the church's politics. The host, struggling to process, asked, Why you, Jonathan? Why would he trust you with this? Jonathan's gaze softened, but his voice was resolute. Because he saw someone who could carry light through the dark, someone the world wouldn't expect. He looked at the audience, his eyes burning with purpose. And because I've seen the shadow myself. The studio held its breath, sensing the final revelation was near. Jonathan's hand hovered over the folder, ready to unveil the last piece of truth that could change everything or put him in the crosshairs of forces far greater than he knew. The late-night talk show studio was a crucible of raw emotion, every heart pounding, as Jonathan Roumie's revelations reached their zenith. The golden rosary on the table glowed under the stage lights, a silent anchor to the seismic truth he'd unearthed a secret letter from Pope Francis exposing wolves within the church, a prophecy of a false friend who would hollow out faith anonymous warnings tied to a shadowy Sine nominee network, and a haunting photograph of a hooded figure watching from the Vatican's garden. The audience, gripped by awe and unease, hung on his every word, their earlier hopes for light-hearted banter buried under the weight of a mystery that spanned the sacred and the sinister. The host, his composure shattered, could barely steer the moment as Jonathan's story veered toward its final perilous edge. As he reached for his folder one last time, the studio braced for a truth that could either illuminate the world or plunge him into the shadows he'd glimpsed. The cameras rolled, but the real story was about to echo far beyond the screen. The host, his voice trembling, broke the heavy silence. "Jonathan, you've shown us letters, prophecies, photos of someone watching you. What's left? What's this final thing you need to share?" His eyes darted to the crew, hoping for a signal to cut, but none came. Jonathan, the actor known for The Chosen, sat resolute, his gaze steady but weary, the rosary before him like a talisman. "The Pope's warning wasn't just for me," he said, his voice low but piercing. "It was for everyone. And what I'm about to show you is why I can't stay silent anymore." The audience leaned forward, a collective breath held as Jonathan's hand moved to his folder, pulling out a small, worn notebook. "This," he said, holding it up, "is where I've kept everything since that night in the Vatican. Thoughts, dreams, fragments of what he told me." He opened it, revealing pages dense with handwriting, sketches, and cryptic symbols. "After the dream, the second one, just before his death, I started writing more. Not just questions, but answers that came to me like they weren't mine." The host's eyes widened. "Answers?" From where Jonathan's expression darkened, not with fear, but with a quiet resolve. "I don't know, but they're tied to what he feared, the void he saw coming." He flipped to a page marked with a crude drawing of an eye, the words "Sine Nomine Vivit" scrawled beneath. "This phrase," he said, "it's not just a warning, it's a call." The Pope believed faith was starving, not from doubt, but from illusion, a hollow imitation of goodness. He paused, his voice dropping. He saw someone rising not as an enemy, but as a mirror, empty inside, gaining power through charm and deception. And he believed it was already beginning. The audience murmured, the prophecy's weight sinking deeper. Jonathan set the notebook down, his eyes scanning the room. The letters kept coming after his death, he said. "More warnings, more urgent. One arrived last week, slipped under my door." He pulled a typewritten note from the folder, reading aloud. "The shadow is near. Silence protects, but only for so long. Choose wisely." The audience gasped, the host's face paling. "Another threat?" he asked. Jonathan shook his head. "Not a threat, a plea. Whoever sent these, they're not my enemy. They're afraid, just like the Pope was." He reached into the folder again, pulling out a final photograph, smaller than the others, its edges frayed. "This came with the last letter," he said, holding it face down. "It's the fourth image of the hooded figure." The studio was deathly silent, every eye locked on the photo. "It was taken here in LA outside my hotel 3 weeks ago." The host's voice cracked. "They're following you." Jonathan nodded, his expression grim. "They've been following me since the Vatican." But this time the figure was closer. Too close. He flipped the photo over, shielding it from the cameras but letting the host glimpse it. "Look here," he said, pointing to the corner. The figure's face is still hidden, but there's a detail, a ring on their hand, engraved with a symbol. The host squinted, his breath catching. "What symbol?" Jonathan's voice dropped to a whisper. "A cross, but inverted." The audience stirred, a wave of unease rippling through. "I found the same symbol in those hidden Bible notes," Jonathan continued. "It's not Sine Nomine. It's something older, darker, something the Pope feared would rise with the void." The host, overwhelmed, tried to ground the moment. "Jonathan, this is terrifying. Are you saying there's a conspiracy not just in the church but beyond it?" Jonathan's eyes met his, unflinching. "I'm saying the Pope saw a world starving for truth, and someone, something ready to feed it, lies." He chose me because I'm not part of that world, because I carry silence, not noise. He paused, his voice softening. But silence isn't enough anymore. The door he spoke of in the dream, it's opening whether I want it to or not. The audience was silent, the weight of his words crushing the air. Jonathan's gaze returned to the rosary, his fingers brushing it. The last dream came 2 nights ago, he said, his voice vivid but heavy. I was back in the basilica, the dust thicker, the silence louder. The Pope was there, but he wasn't alone. The hooded figure stood behind him, closer than ever, its face still hidden. He turned to me and said, "The shadow is here. Your silence is breaking, and so is the world's." The host's eyes widened. What did he mean? Jonathan's expression was haunted. He said, "Faith isn't gone, it's waiting. But silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it's the beginning of war." The audience exhaled as one, a shared gasp of awe and dread. He told me to show the world what I've seen, not to hide it. That's why I'm here. He set the photograph down, his voice resolute. I'm opening the door he spoke of live in front of you all. The host, his voice barely audible, asked, "Are you afraid, Jonathan?" Of what this means, of who's watching? Jonathan's lips curved into a tired smile. I was. But the Pope wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of dying for nothing. If I don't speak now, his fear comes true. He looked directly into the camera, his voice steady but urgent. This isn't about the church alone. It's about us, what we choose to believe, what we let rise. The shadow is closer than we think. The studio was a sea of hushed reverence, the audience clinging to his words. Jonathan reached for the folder one last time, pulling out a final note, handwritten unlike the others. This came yesterday, he said. No sender, just these words. The light you carry will burn, but it will not fail. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. I don't know who sent it, but it's why I'm here. The Pope saw something in me, a man who carries silence with dignity. And now I'm asking you to carry it too. The host, overwhelmed, managed a weak response. Jonathan, you've changed everything tonight. What happens now? Jonathan's gaze softened, but his voice was firm. We wait. The shadow will show itself, just as the Pope said. But faith isn't dead. It's waiting for us to act. He stood, the rosary glinting as he moved toward the curtain. At the edge, he turned back, his voice a quiet thunder. If you think this ends here, wait, because what came after this was worse. The audience erupted in hushed murmurs, some clapping instinctively, others too stunned to move. The host sat frozen, the cameras lingering on the rosary and the photographs. Off air, the story exploded on X, sharing silence. Breaks trending globally within hours. Clips of Jonathan's revelations spread like wildfire, sparking debates, prayers, and fear. Anonymous posts echoed Sine, Nomine, vivat, while others warned of shadows in plain sight. Jonathan returned to his quiet life, but the notebook stayed with him, its pages growing heavier with each dream. The hooded figure's ring haunted him, a symbol of something ancient stirring. Months later, a small news story emerged. A Vatican archive was unsealed, revealing notes in the Pope's hand, echoing Jonathan's letter. The church stayed silent, but Sine Nomine whispers grew louder. Jonathan spoke at small gatherings, not for fame, but for truth, urging others to carry light through the dark. The final letter's words, "The light will burn, but it will not fail," became a mantra shared by millions. The shadow remained unseen, but Jonathan knew it was near. His silence had broken, and the world was waking. The door was open, and the war the Pope foresaw had begun.